Already this month, energy prices have risen 54%, inflation is over 6%, and as of today, people face paying increased national insurance. But instead of helping the British people, Rishi Sunak seems intent on doing even more damage. The Telegraph reports that Rishi has blocked a plan that would make energy bills cheaper. The policy in question is the government's Green Homes Plan, which was set to provide £200 million to go towards home insulation and boiler upgrades. This was always, let's be clear, a paltry amount of money. But according to The Telegraph, tens of households would have benefited, and the move would have been championed by the government as a boost to ease the cost of living crunch. But even at only £200 million, a paltry £200 million, less than the Sunak's net worth, the Chancellor has blocked the proposal. Bills shall remain high and Britain's homes drafty. And the move has left some of his colleagues fuming. A senior government figure said, "It would have been something that we could say to households. We're on your side. We want to reduce your bills, but the Treasury doesn't believe in it." The source added that the Treasury had kept removing lines from the energy strategy that had spending implications, despite support from Number 10 and the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy, calling the situation ridiculous. The defence from the Treasury was this. An ally of Mr. Sunak countered on Tuesday night saying, "We have to be scrutinising every extra penny of taxpayer money that is proposed for spending because ultimately we want to do the Conservative thing and cut taxes for people." So just as we expected, they're not hiding this. The reason that even these scraping the barrel bare minimum policies aren't getting funding is that Rishi Sunak wants to cut taxes just before the next election. Owen Jones, how low will this guy go?
Well, I think it exposes what Rishi Sunak always was, to be honest with you, which was a kind of Ayn Rand style roll back the state, because the reason he had this popularity, bear in mind he was the most popular politician in the country for quite a while, is because he was associated with furlough and throwing huge amounts of money at people during the COVID crisis. And that obviously was the support you got across the Western world. Now he's obviously associated with hiking national insurance, for example, and slashing universal credit. And the fact is he's a right-wing Thatcherite who actually clashes with some of the instincts of Boris Johnson, who doesn't have a clear, distinct ideology, but actually is more well-disposed towards spending and using the state in a very Tory way, but nonetheless more statist. And fundamentally, Rishi Sunak is a right-wing ideologue who opposes using the state, including to combat the existential crisis facing humanity, which is the climate emergency. I mean, it's interesting. I mean, people wouldn't have watched it, no one did, but Andrew Neil on GB News, he interviewed Rishi Sunak on the issue of the net zero target. And in it was very clear that Rishi Sunak just was not comfortable at all with net zero, or indeed the massive government support needed in order to take on the climate emergency. So it's not really a surprise. His so-called green credentials have always been very weak. So I think what's interesting is, because we're seeing at the moment Rishi Sunak's approval ratings have collapsed. And the reason they've collapsed is because he's been exposed as a right-wing ideologue. And that actually goes against the instincts, not just of people on the left, Labour voters, but actually some of the coalition that the Tories won over. I mean, bear in mind, yeah, it's true. On certain issues, a lot of those voters in various northern towns, which traditionally voted for Labour, are quite socially conservative. But the polling on issues like green issues is it shows that in the so-called red wall, people do want action to take on the climate emergency. The idea that they're all a bunch of knuckle-dragging Neanderthals who think, who are indifferent to the future of the planet isn't true. So the fact Rishi Sunak isn't showing any indication that he wants to use the muscle of the state to take on the climate emergency, I don't think is going down well. Well, it won't go down well because it's already part of a general package which has exposed Rishi Sunak exactly as he was. He's a political fraud. He's been exposed for what he is, which is a actually very committed, hard-right economic ideologue in a way Boris Johnson isn't actually. And
an incredibly rich one. So, his skepticism of net zero, maybe it's because he has 3 massive houses, 4 cars, as we talked about on a recent show. I want to talk about energy prices because this is why it's such bad timing to have a chancellor who's ideologically opposed to any kind of state intervention. The Telegraph published this pretty terrifying graph. The pale blue line shows the OBR's energy bill forecast. They predict that the average bill will rise to just under £3,000 by the autumn. But Goldman Sachs have released an even more stark forecast, saying bills will rise to just under £4,000 by October. And this is the context in which Martin Lewis has published a stark new guide for people struggling financially. It's a guide to surviving the cost of living crisis, important choice of words there. And it contains 90 tips, including this on getting free food, free KFC, donuts, coffee, or even get paid to eat. So he's telling people, essentially collect vouchers. He also has advice on food banks, saying that sadly 2.5 million food parcels had to be given away last year. There's no shame in it. Of course, there is no shame in it, but he's absolutely right. It's tragic that this many people are having to rely on food parcels. Perhaps, though, the starkest section in his guide was this: boil and flask hot showers in public places, creative ways to minimize energy use. Oh, in Martin Lewis's guide, full of great advice. He's been a very effective campaigner during this period of time. I mean, it is so stark, though, isn't it, that you've got, the most high-profile guy who's telling you how to save money, and now he's telling you try and have a shower in a public place. This is going to be a really, really stark year for so many people, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, he's already said actually publicly that the tools he had available throughout his career to offer people who are struggling, he doesn't really have them anymore because things have got so bad. I think it's worth bearing in mind, by the way, that even before this current squeeze in people's living standards, since 2010, working people had gone through the longest squeeze in their wages in real terms since the Napoleonic era in the beginning of the 19th century. So you already had this completely unprecedented squeeze in people's wages. Now, for a while, because of the pandemic, I think there was a narrative for a while that actually, because there was such a demand now for labor, that actually you would see people's wages go up. And clearly now we're actually seeing the steepest fall in people's wages since records began. What that means, I think, it is worth spelling it out when you talk to charities. What that means, it means, for example, parents skipping hot meals in order to feed their children. That's what it means in practice. It means children too humiliated to invite their friends round for dinner. It means pensioners not heating their homes and going cold. It means things like not being able to afford school uniform. And it means sleepless nights, staring at ceilings, worrying about unopened energy bills on tables. Those are the sorts of experiences that right now millions of households have to go through. And for a while, the Tory mantra, which fueled the kind of George Osborne so-called welfare reform agenda, which is obviously slash and burn cuts to the welfare state, was that your salvation was work, that if you worked your way, then that was the way out of poverty, and the rest were so-called lazy scroungers and all the rest of it. But obviously, the reality is most households below the poverty line in this country are in work. And what they've done in terms of cuts to universal credit and tax credits before that and so on, is they've withdrawn support from low-paid working households. What you're seeing is this perfect storm, of course, because the welfare state, the social security system in this country has been cut to the bones, whilst you're getting external shocks, which, yes, all of the countries are dealing with, which people in this country are particularly exposed to after already suffering such a protracted squeeze in wages. And this will have devastating consequences. I wrote a column the other week, which I just think is an important point to make. And I think sometimes on the left we're squeamish about making this point, but it is important, which is that poverty kills. I mean, it's a killer in this country because all the statistics show that those who are driven into poverty and hardship have lower life expectancies. They are more susceptible to various long-term health conditions, which obviously make people live less happy and healthy lives, but also live less long. I mean, that's everything from mental distress and mental and physical health problems can feed upon each other, anxiety, depression. It also means everything from high blood pressure, heart problems, for example. We know that children who grow up in overcrowded homes are more likely to have asthma. This is something which is going to actually not just make people feel insecure and having to make terrible choices like, will I have to skip my meal to make sure my kid's fed? But it will also mean, in a country where we've seen COVID disproportionately kill people who are poorer, and that just brought into sharp relief the fact that our economic system leads to people who are poorer living less healthy and shorter lives. And that will be the consequence. People will die as a consequence of being driven into poverty, insecurity, and hardship. People might be squeamish about saying it, but it is a statistical, inarguable fact.